Lieutenant Adam Hawkins lay prone in the dense underbrush of the alien planet, his breath shallow and controlled, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. The Xrithian base loomed ahead through the mist-shrouded forest, its towering structures bristling with technology far beyond human understanding. Hawkins and his small team had been sent on a reconnaissance mission to gather intelligence, but something had gone wrong. The enemy had anticipated their arrival. His team had already engaged in a fierce firefight as they fought their way through the thick jungle toward their objective, but numbers were not in their favor. The Xrithians, despite being a fraction of their size and strength, were well-trained and equipped with weapons far more advanced than anything humanity could field. Hawkins gritted his teeth as he scanned the terrain for an escape route, but he could already hear the hum of enemy drones overhead searching for signs of human resistance. A flash of light burst from the trees nearby, and Hawkins barely had time to react as a series of explosive rounds pelted the ground around him. The blast sent him tumbling through the air, his body slamming into a jagged rock. With a sickening crunch, pain exploded across his side as he struggled to push himself up. Blood trickled from a wound on his forehead, and his vision swam as he tried to focus on his surroundings. His squad was scattered. The firefight had become a disorganized mess. Hawkins had no choice but to keep moving, knowing that if he stayed in one spot for too long, the Xrithians would have him surrounded in seconds. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stand up straight, his mind sharpening as the adrenaline kicked in. But even as he staggered toward cover, he realized it was already too late. The enemy had already anticipated his movements, their forces closing in faster than he could escape. Hawkins could feel the weight of their weapons aimed in his direction the moment he took another step. His rifle was useless against the overwhelming force of the Xrithians' weapons that could vaporize his position with a single blast. He made the choice to surrender, hoping to survive long enough to regroup with the rest of his team, or at least send a distress signal to the Federation. But the Xrithians were not interested in mercy or negotiation. Hawkins' eyes narrowed as they closed in around him. Their leader, a massive alien figure draped in dark armor, stepped forward with a cruel grin on its face. Hawkins recognized it immediately as Commander Zuruk, one of the highest-ranking officials in the Xrithian military. Jarek's eyes glinted with disdain as he studied Hawkins, as if the human soldier were little more than a piece of discarded equipment. "You thought you could defeat us with such primitive weapons?" Jarek's voice boomed, his words filled with mockery. How quaint! Hawkins clenched his fists and fought to keep his composure, even as the Xrithians closed in around him, their weapons trained on his every move. Jarek gestured to his subordinates, and they seized Hawkins, roughly pulling his arms behind his back and shackling him without hesitation. "Take him to the holding facility," Jarek ordered, his voice dripping with contempt. "We shall see how long the famous human spirit lasts in our hands." As Hawkins was dragged away through the alien base, his thoughts raced, but he kept his face impassive. They may have won this battle, but he was far from finished. The war had just begun. Hawkins was thrust into a cold metallic cell, his body aching from the rough handling. As the Xrithians shoved him forward, the heavy door clanged shut behind him, locking with a sharp hiss, and the sound echoed through the chamber like a death sentence. He glanced around, taking in the dim light, the smooth walls of the containment area, and the faint hum of alien machinery that buzzed somewhere nearby. His restraints were tight, but he was used to worse. His focus remained sharp, knowing that being captured was just another challenge. The door slid open again moments later, and two Xrithian guards stepped inside. One of them was a towering figure, his dark blue skin glistening under the lights, while the other was smaller, though no less menacing. They studied Hawkins with curiosity and amusement, as if they had never seen a human before. One of the guards chuckled in a deep, rasping voice. "This one looks even weaker than the others." Hawkins straightened up, ignoring the burning sensation in his side. He said nothing, not giving them the satisfaction of a response. His silence only seemed to amuse them more. The larger Xrithian crouched down before him, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the human soldier as though he were some kind of specimen to be studied. "Do you understand us, human?" The Xrithian's voice was slow and deliberate. Hawkins finally looked up, meeting the alien's gaze. His tone was calm, but filled with defiance. "I understand enough," he replied. The Xrithian guard's lips curled into a sneer, as if he had just heard the funniest thing he'd ever encountered. "Oh, this one thinks he is clever," he said. "Perhaps you will learn the true meaning of strength while you beg for mercy." The guard turned away, signaling to his companion, and they left the cell, leaving Hawkins alone once more. He was used to being taunted, but this was different. They weren't just mocking him. They were treating him like a joke. The idea that his kind could be so easily captured and held was unfathomable to them. Hawkins spent the next several hours in silence, his mind racing. He tried to assess the facility, the routines of his captors, the layout of the area, all the small details that could help him when the time came to escape. He knew that they saw him as insignificant, but that was the mistake the Xrithians would soon regret. Days passed, and the mockery only grew more frequent. Each time the guards came to check on him, they laughed at his humanity, commenting on his frailty and lack of natural abilities compared to their race. The Xrithians reveled in their perceived superiority, psychic powers, immense strength, and near impenetrable armor. And each time Hawkins refused to show any sign of fear or weakness, they became more frustrated. Commander Zurok visited him once, towering above the human with a look of contempt in his eyes. "You are nothing," he said coldly. "You cannot even comprehend the power we hold." Hawkins didn't flinch at the insult. Instead, he stared back with a calm resolve. "You'll learn just how wrong you are," he said quietly. The Trithian commander leaned forward slightly, his mouth twisting into a smile that sent a chill through the room. "I will enjoy watching you break," he said, turning on his heel to leave. But Hawkins refused to break. He knew the Xrithians were playing their games, testing him, trying to break his spirit. But it was clear to him now that their arrogance was their biggest flaw. They underestimated the human will to survive and fight back. That would be their downfall. The days blurred together in the sterile isolation of his cell. The rhythmic sound of footsteps outside his door became a constant reminder that he was being watched, measured, and dissected by his captors. But Hawkins had learned to tune out the noise. The pain in his side had faded into a dull throb, a constant companion as he sat quietly in the corner, his back against the cold wall. He had no illusions about the nature of his captivity. He knew the Xrithians were studying him, pushing him, trying to break something deep within him. But they weren't going to win. It wasn't strength they were testing, not really. It was willpower. The human spirit was something that couldn't be measured with their alien technology, no matter how advanced. Hawk had seen it in his comrades, in himself, and he knew that it was something the Xrithians had no way of understanding. They could mock him, torture him, and push him to the brink, but they couldn't break him. Each day, as the mocking continued, Hawkins focused on the things that kept him grounded: his family, his friends, the memories of the life he fought to protect. His mind would wander to his comrades back on the battlefield, the faces of the soldiers who had fought beside him, who had fallen beside him. That bond, that unshakable unity, was something the Xrithians would never understand. He could hear them outside the door, arguing amongst themselves. The guards were getting more frustrated, growing agitated with every failed attempt to break his resolve. But Hawkins didn't care. They thought they had control, but they had underestimated him from the start. The more they mocked him, the more determined he became. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a symbol of everything humanity stood for: resilience, adaptability, and the refusal to give up in the face of impossible odds. He could feel the fire inside him building with each passing hour, a slow burn of defiance that would one day explode in their faces. Hawkins had started to observe the layout of the facility with more focus, more purpose. There were small cracks in the security, moments when the alien systems faltered, areas where the guards weren't paying attention. He wasn't just sitting in his cell anymore. He was watching, studying, planning. They might have been the ones with superior technology, but he had something they didn't: creativity, the ability to adapt, and the relentless will to survive. He had noticed the small vents in the corners of the room. They were meant for ventilation, but to Hawkins, they looked like potential escape routes. There were patterns in the guard rotations, times when he could move without being seen. As the days passed, Hawkins began to focus more on the tiny details. The way the Xrithians interacted, the way the guards would occasionally drop their guard when they thought no one was watching. They were so focused on their own superiority, so convinced of their dominance, that they hadn't noticed him watching them, learning from their mistakes. In the silence of his cell, Hawkins would practice his breathing, steadying his mind. He trained his body in the limited space he had, doing push-ups, sit-ups, anything to keep his strength up. His mind was equally sharp, constantly formulating his next move, visualizing how he would escape when the moment arrived. They had underestimated humanity. They had mocked him for his weakness, his primitive nature. But Hawkins knew one thing for certain. The moment they realized their mistake, it would be too late. Days passed, and the cycle of mockery continued, but Hawkins was no longer bothered by it. The taunts, the jeers, the endless psychological games. They were all part of the same strategy, and they no longer held any power over him. Instead of letting his frustration grow, he focused on something far more important: escape. Every moment, every detail, was now part of his plan. Hawkins had spent countless hours observing the layout of the facility. He'd memorized the shifts of the Xrithian guards, the patrol routes, and the subtle inconsistencies in the alien security systems. The Xrithians thought they were untouchable, that their technology and physical strength were enough to control a human. They couldn't have been more wrong. The guards, though physically superior, lacked the discipline of a well-trained human soldier. They were overconfident, too comfortable in their superiority, and that was their mistake. They were predictable. They believed the cell blocks were secure, that nothing could breach the fortress-like walls they had built around their prison. What they failed to account for was the adaptability of the human mind. Hawkins began testing small things in his environment, subtle manipulations. He started working on the shackles that bound his wrists, not with brute force but with precision. Using the rough edge of the concrete wall, he slowly started to wear away at the restraints. It wasn't much, just a fraction of an inch, but it was a start. Every night, he would work on them, his hands trembling with anticipation, praying that no one would come in and catch him in the act. He also started paying more attention to the facility's structure. There were cameras in every corner, but they were not perfect. Every now and then, he'd catch a glitch in the feed, a momentary flicker when the guards weren't paying attention, when the machine's eye blinked, allowing him to slip unnoticed into the shadows. His cell had a small vent in the corner, barely large enough to fit a human arm, but it was a potential weakness, something he could use to his advantage. Hawkins didn't rush. Rushing would only get him caught. Every decision had to be calculated, every move deliberate. He began to time the guards' shifts, watching how they interacted with each other, noting their weak points. Some were more diligent than others, but none seemed to understand the danger of underestimating him. His captors had seen him as a simple prisoner, a means to an end, but Hawkins was playing the long game. One of the guards had begun to show signs of boredom. Hawkins noticed how he would glance at his wrist chronometer every few minutes, tapping it as if impatient for the shift to end. It was small, but it was an opening. The more Hawkins observed, the more he realized that the guards had a set routine, and within that routine, there were small gaps that would allow him to make his move. He also started to practice his strength in subtle ways. The room was small, and there wasn't much space to move, but Hawkins made do. Every muscle in his body ached from the exercises he performed daily. Push-ups, squats, sit-ups, anything to keep his body ready. His legs had taken the brunt of the impact from the earlier explosion, but he would not let that slow him down. His goal was simple. When the moment came, he needed to be ready to run, to fight, to survive. And in the back of his mind, he could feel the tension building. The day was coming. Hawkins was ready to show the Xrithians what humanity was capable of. They had mocked him for too long. Now it was his turn to make them regret it. Hawkins could feel it now, the calm before the storm. Every minute that passed, every detail he observed, everything he had studied and memorized over the past few weeks brought him one step closer to the moment he had been waiting for. The tension was palpable, thickening in the air like a looming thunderstorm. He could sense the subtle shifts in the routine of the Xrithians, could feel their increasing impatience with him as they tried, and failed, to break his spirit. They were growing frustrated, and that was exactly what he needed. The mockery had slowed, becoming less frequent, and Hawkins noticed the change. The Exrithians were becoming distracted, their confidence turning into arrogance. They thought they had broken him, thought he was just another defeated human to add to their list of conquered enemies. They didn't realize that every sneer, every taunting remark, only made him more determined. They believed their superiority would last forever, but Hawkins knew better. The more they underestimated him, the more vulnerable they became. The guards, once vigilant, now seemed careless. They would pass by his cell, sometimes talking to each other instead of watching him, their voices growing louder as their conversations became more personal. It was small things, but Hawkins noticed every change, every shift in the pattern. He'd also noticed the complacency in their movements, the way they would stand still for just a moment too long, the way their eyes would wander. They were beginning to believe the walls around them were unbreakable. They were wrong. He had been waiting for this, a lapse in their security, and now it was here. The small vent in the corner of his cell, once nothing more than a potential escape route, was beginning to look more promising. It was tight, far too small for an adult human to crawl through easily, but Hawkins had spent hours studying it, measuring it in his mind. He was tall and broad, but he wasn't without his own advantages. Flexibility, agility, and the right amount of determination were all he needed. He took a deep breath, checking his restraints again, testing the subtle give he had worked so hard to create. The shackles were still tight, but there was a small gap now, a sliver of hope. He knew that if he pushed just a little harder, it might be enough to free himself. But he couldn't risk doing that yet. Patience was the key. Each day, he studied the guards' routine even more closely, learning their patterns like a predator tracking prey. There was one guard in particular, the one who had grown tired and bored of the monotony. He had started leaving his post early, often wandering off to chat with the other guards. It was a small mistake, but one that Hawkins had been waiting for. He had been patient, observing every flaw in the system, and now it was finally paying off. The time for inaction was over. Hawkins knew that the next few days would be crucial. He could feel it in his gut. Something was about to happen, something that would tip the scales in his favor. The key was simple. He had to act before the Exrithians realized their mistake. If he moved too soon, he would fail. But if he waited too long, they might find a way to tighten their grip even further. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to spring into action. Hawkins was not the prisoner here, not anymore. The Exrithians would soon realize that they had made the greatest mistake of their lives, underestimating the human spirit. The day had come. Hawkins could feel the shift in the air, the building tension in his body. His mind was sharp, his muscles coiled with anticipation. For days he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Now he could almost taste the freedom that awaited him. He had worked tirelessly over the past several weeks. His shackles were nearly free. The small vent in the corner of the cell was now a plausible escape route, large enough for him to crawl through if the need arose. And the guards, their routines had become predictable, their vigilance waning with every passing hour. They were too complacent, too confident. They thought they had won. They were wrong. Hawkins had learned to read the smallest shifts in the behavior of the guards. There was one, an older, more tired guard who had become increasingly careless. He had started to skip his patrols early, his footsteps dragging as though the monotony of the job had worn him down. Hawkins had noticed it first, a minor detail that most would overlook. That was the crack in their fortress, and now it was time to exploit it. He waited for the right moment. The guard would pass by his cell in just a few minutes, and that was when Hawkins would make his move. Everything hinged on that one moment. Hawkins had learned how to control his breathing, how to slow his heart rate. His pulse was steady, his mind calm. He was no longer the prisoner in the cell. He was the hunter, and the Exrithians were the prey. The sound of footsteps grew louder. The guard was approaching. Hawkins closed his eyes for a brief moment, gathering his focus. He could hear the guard's voice as he muttered to himself, the tone irritated. The moment the guard passed his cell, Hawkins moved quickly. He gripped the bars of his cell door with both hands, sliding his wrists out of the partially loosened shackles. The metal scraped against his skin, but the pain was nothing compared to the feeling of freedom that flooded through him. He was free. The guard was still a few steps away. Hawkins moved like a shadow, his body low to the ground, slipping through the gap in his cell door. His heart raced, but his movements were smooth, calculated. He had no time to waste. He had memorized the layout of the facility, and now he had to trust his instincts. He slipped through the hallway, crouching behind corners, avoiding the patrols with practiced precision. He had learned the patrol schedules by heart, and he used that knowledge to stay just ahead of the guards. Every corner was a risk, every shadow a potential hiding place, but Hawkins was ready. He moved silently, his every step carefully measured. The facility's layout was more complicated than he had imagined, but Hawkins had been watching for days, noting every detail. He knew where the guards would be, and he knew where they wouldn't. The prison's main control room was nearby. If he could reach it, he could disable the security systems and create a clear path to escape. As he approached the control room, Hawkins could hear the voices of the Extrithians echoing through the hallways. His pulse quickened, but he didn't stop. He had come too far to turn back now. He crouched low, waiting for the perfect moment to slip into the control room unnoticed. Seconds stretched into eternity, but Hawkins held his breath, trusting the plan he had spent so long perfecting. The Extrithians had underestimated him, and now he was about to show them just how wrong they were. The escape had begun. Hawkins held his breath as the door to the control room slid open with a soft hiss. His heart pounded in his chest, every muscle taut with the anticipation of what was about to happen. He had studied the layout of the facility for days, memorized the positions of every guard, the placement of security cameras, the sound of every door. His entire escape plan had hinged on this moment, and now, as the doors opened to reveal a dimly lit room filled with alien technology, he felt the weight of everything fall on his shoulders. The control room was sleek, filled with glowing panels and strange, intricate devices that Hawkins couldn't even begin to understand. Alien technology that had been designed to keep him locked away, to keep him and his comrades from escaping. But to Hawkins, it was nothing more than another obstacle to overcome. It had no power over him, not now. There were two guards stationed inside, their backs turned to the entrance. They were focused on the control panels, their alien eyes glued to the blinking screens, unaware of the human soldier who had slipped in behind them. Hawkins didn't hesitate. Moving quickly and silently, he reached into the pouch on his belt and pulled out a small EMP device, a tool he had swiped earlier from one of the unconscious Shrithian patrols. He pressed it against the wall and activated the device. A pulse of energy rippled through the room, and for a brief moment, the entire facility seemed to go still. The lights flickered, and the humming sound of the machine sputtered. The guards, startled by the sudden loss of power, turned quickly, eyes wide with confusion. They didn't even have time to react before Hawkins was on them, his training kicking in as he moved with the speed and precision of a predator. The first guard never saw him coming. Hawkins slammed into him, knocking him against the console. The Extrithian stumbled, dazed, but before he could recover, Hawkins had already moved on to the second guard. The second Trithian swung his fist, but Hawkins ducked and slammed his elbow into the alien's gut, forcing the wind out of him. The guard crumpled to the ground, and Hawkins quickly grabbed a nearby energy rifle, using it to incapacitate both aliens with a precise shot to each of their limbs. The control room was silent again, save for the soft hum of the disabled machines. Hawkins stood over the two incapacitated guards, his breath coming in quick, controlled bursts. He had done it. He had neutralized the immediate threat. Now he needed to finish what he had started. The security systems were down for now, but Hawkins knew they wouldn't stay that way for long. He moved quickly to the central console, his fingers flying over the alien controls as he tried to piece together the technology. He could see the data streaming across the screens, maps of the facility, the locations of all the guards, the power systems. Hawkins pulled up a map of the entire complex, searching for the exit. His fingers hovered over the buttons, a wave of uncertainty sweeping over him for the briefest of moments. But then his eyes hardened. He knew exactly what needed to be done. With a steady hand, he activated the emergency release systems, triggering an alert that would open the main exit doors. He glanced at the flashing lights and began to move toward the exit, but then a new sound reached his ears. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. More guards were coming. Hawkins cursed under his breath. The countdown had begun. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the narrow hallways as Hawkins glanced quickly at the control room door. His heart raced as he slammed the last few commands into the alien console, ensuring that the main exit doors would open when the emergency system was activated. But time was running out. He didn't have much longer before the guards arrived, and when they did, it wouldn't be just a few. It would be an army of Srithians bent on catching him. He had one shot at this. Hawkins sprinted to the door, grabbing the rifle from the console and slinging it over his shoulder. He could hear the clatter of boots just beyond the hallway, a telltale sign that they were getting closer. His mind was racing, his body moving on instinct as he ducked into a nearby ventilation shaft. The small, narrow vent was his only escape route now. If he could make it through without alerting the guards, he might have a chance. He crawled through the shaft, his chest tight as the cold metal scraped against his skin. His heart thudded in his ears, drowning out all other sounds as he moved faster, crawling through the darkened passage with the calculated precision he had trained for. The shaft twisted and turned, but Hawkins kept his focus, feeling the slight vibrations of the complex beneath his hands and feet. The faintest light at the end of the tunnel began to emerge. The exit was close, but so were the guards. Hawkins could hear their voices now, shouting commands, moving closer to the main control room. He had moments, perhaps only seconds, before they realized what had happened. He pushed himself harder, his arms and legs burning with the effort. Sweat trickled down his brow, staining his eyes, but he wiped it away without a second thought. He couldn't afford to slow down now. He had to keep moving. Finally, he reached the end of the vent. There, before him, was a small hatch. It wasn't much, but it was his way out. Hawkins took a deep breath, bracing himself, and pushed the hatch open with all the strength he could muster. The room on the other side was dark, but he didn't waste time looking around. He could hear the Extrithian guards just down the hall, their heavy footsteps drawing closer. He had to move fast. He slipped out of the vent and into the maintenance corridor, crouching low, his rifle ready. He could see the emergency exit just ahead, the large, reinforced doors that led to the outside world. The doors would be locked, but Hawkins had already done the hard work. The systems were disabled. They would open. He just had to make it there in time. He darted toward the doors, staying in the shadows as much as possible. The corridor was dimly lit, and the lights flickered above, giving him just enough cover. He moved quickly but cautiously. If the guards saw him now, there was no way he would escape. Every step was calculated, every move deliberate. As he neared the exit, the sound of the guards' voices grew louder. They were right behind him. Hawkins glanced over his shoulder, his heart in his throat, but he couldn't stop now. He was so close. He reached the control panel beside the exit doors, his fingers flying over the buttons. A loud click echoed through the corridor as the massive doors began to open. Freedom was within his grasp. Just as the doors cracked open, Hawkins turned and sprinted forward, his legs burning as he surged toward the unknown. The cold air of the outside world hit him like a wave, and for the briefest moment, he felt the weight of everything he had survived. But there was no time to savor it. He ran faster now, dodging behind a series of metal crates and barrels to put distance between himself and the facility. The guards would be out soon, but he wouldn't stop. Not until he was beyond their reach. Hawkins didn't look back. He had done the impossible. He had escaped.